At the GSB, we study a lot of different types of businesses. And one of the things that I think we're all interested in is international businesses. And one of the things that the curriculum doesn't include as much of as I would like is looking at international businesses that are working in the developing world. So I was thinking about why that is. And I think the first reason is that it's hard. There aren't a lot of businesses that are doing it or doing it well that a case study would be written about. But it's also something that I think there are lots of opportunities in. And our panelists are here today to talk a little bit about how their organizations that they are working for, have worked for, have worked in this field that is definitely messy, that is definitely complicated, a lot more so than regular business in the US, for example, which is difficult enough in itself. So these three panelists all have different backgrounds and experiences. One works with a consulting firm, one with a firm that's focused on, or one did work with a consulting firm, one works with a firm that's focused on infrastructure building, and one with a multinational company. I think these are three very different ways that we can think about working with international businesses, whether that's what we do immediately out of school or that's something that we do down the road. So I'm going to turn it over to them to introduce themselves, and I thank you in advance. Thanks for being here. Why don't we start with Jane?
Okay, I'm Jane Sito. I work for Bechtel Enterprises. It's sort of the in-house development investment banking arm of Bechtel Group. And my background is I was an engineer actually by training. I worked in the Silicon Valley, then I went to business school, and then I joined Bechtel, and I've been there ever since. And how far am I supposed to go?
Yeah, why don't we actually start? I'll just set it up a little bit better. Why don't I give each of you sort of 5, 7, 8 minutes, whatever you want, to introduce yourself and tell you a little bit about, tell us a little bit about what you are doing, what your thoughts on this whole field of private sector development is. Just give us a bit of an introduction to this area. And then I'll moderate on some questions, and then I'll open it up to questions from everyone. We'll probably go till about 7:15 or so. That works for everyone here. So what do you
Okay, so in terms of what I've been doing with Bechtel, I started off doing project finance in the U.S., and then I moved to Asia. And in terms of project finance, it's non-recourse financing, investing in infrastructure projects to help countries develop. Toll roads, power projects, airports, etc. And I liked it. It was pretty fun. You get to live in a great city. I lived in Hong Kong for about 3 years, worked all over Australia, Malaysia, Indonesia. And it's really fun working with local governments, local partners on how to develop these power projects or water treatment plants. And I can go into little stories of that as well later.
Okay. I'm a GSBer. I was class of '85. I'm currently a partner at the Bridgespan Group, which is, if you can imagine, like Bain & Company, except that we do work with non-profits. In the intervening 20 years between leaving here and joining there this year, and was a number of years a partner at Bain & Company. I ran 3 companies, which included an internet startup, which was fun but didn't make quite as much money as we hoped. But also ran an economic development consulting firm for a while in London called Bannock. I've done some other non-profit work in the meantime, including in South Africa, which is where I lived for a while. I also lived in San Francisco, Toronto, South Africa, Sao Paulo, London in the intervening 20 years. For me, private sector development is really about alleviating poverty in the third world. I think personally there's no greater indignity that goes with poverty. It affects not just self-esteem, but also ability to look after your kids, healthcare, ability to live life properly. And in reality, if you believe that poverty is a major problem that we should do something about, then you have to think through what it is you can do to tackle that. And my logic flow goes something like this, that frankly the best way to tackle poverty is to create wealth. If you look at the way the development thinking has gone in the intervening 20 years since I was at business school, there's now a pretty strong consensus that if you want to get at the roots of poverty, you need to create what's called pro-poor growth. What that really means is creating lots of sustainable jobs. If you talk to most poor people, what they'll tell you is we want lots of jobs. Don't give us charity, just give us a chance to earn a decent living. If you look at most stages of economic development, pretty much every continent of the world, at almost every decade of the last 200 years, the part of the economies that develop lots and lots of sustainable jobs are nearly always small businesses. There is no country in the world that's gone from poverty to wealth without a vibrant small business sector, with the exception of a couple of odd Gulf states that had a lot of oil, right? And if you look at developed countries, the real engine for job creation in the US today is small business. So what you really want to do if you really care about creating solutions to poverty is help tons and tons of small businesses prosper and succeed in developing countries. So that, for me, is what private sector development is about, is creating prosperity in the developing world through lots and lots of successful businesses. Now, Steve asked us to think of an interesting story, and I thought of a whole bunch of different ones that came through my head. There was one where I actually ended up teaching a class on business in prison in South Africa. I wrote an article about that one, so if you want to learn more about that, I can tell you about it later or read the article. But the one that really brought home the importance of business in the third world to me was a number of years ago I went to Africa to spend a few months traveling around. I just, make a long story short, left one job, had a bit of money in the bank, decided to take a few months out between starting jobs, and just traveled overland over Africa. When I was here in the business school, we had a lot of classes in development economics, and there were lots of discussions around why is Africa poor. And one of the reasons that was given in many discussions was that entrepreneurship is not indigenous in Africa. Now, has anybody here ever been to Africa? Right. Now, to what extent would you say that entrepreneurship is indigenous to Africa? The continent is awash in entrepreneurs, right? You get off the plane and you realize swiftly that this is not a major issue. The problem is there's a whole bunch of barriers that entrepreneurs face in Africa that are huge, and they would be huge if they were here. And it hit me so most sharply one night. To make a long story short, I went out with a bunch of friends in Harare to a nightclub. We met some other people. One of the guys invited me back to his house to meet his wife and kids. And after dinner, this was stretched out over a number of days, he took me out to a bar in a township, or Shabin as it's called, on the edge of Harare. Now, we went from a fairly international neighborhood into a fairly sketchy part of the world, right? So essentially it's a nice way of calling a slum. And this bar was, how to describe it, it's like a brick outhouse. Imagine a brick shed, which was surrounded by people. And out of this, in the middle of the open, they were selling booze. So we got there, we met the whole group of friends we'd met the previous couple of nights in the nightclub, had a wonderful time. Everyone was buying rounds in the English fashion. So it came to my turn, and I thought, well, okay, I ought to buy a round here. But I looked at this melee of people, and to be honest, there was a lot of people there. There were some prostitutes surrounding this little brick place where they were selling the beer. And said to somebody, would you mind, if I give you the money, would you mind going to get my round? He looked at me, he was an army guy, and said, I wouldn't mind. You can go up and buy your own beer. Well, okay, my manhood has been questioned, so I will go. So I fought my way through the crowd. Everyone was very polite. I was somewhat surprised to see this white face, and my head popped up on the bar, and the barman looked at me as if to say, we're dyslexic, what are you doing here? So I said, I'm with some friends, can I buy a round of beer? So he brought me the beer, and I went back. Anyway, a few minutes later, the owner of this bar found me and said, what are you doing here? And so I explained why I was there. I was with my friend Jimmy, always with Jimmy, and so on and so forth. So I asked him about his business. I said, you own a bar. How does it work? So he said, well, I'm the only bar in the neighborhood. This is good. The reason I'm the only bar in the neighborhood is because the government gives no licenses for bars in the neighborhood. So, having studied business at Stanford Business School, I concluded that if they give no licenses, are you illegal? He says, absolutely. So I said, well, how do you survive? Why don't the police close you down? He says, because I bribed them. And the police went by, he waved at them. And he described essentially how, as he saw it, his competitive edge was that he was the only one in the neighborhood, and that he made enough money to bribe the police enough to make sure they would let anybody else open. And we talked a lot about how he served customers, how he kept his costs down. I mean, it was just a little brick building. But fundamentally, a huge chunk of his business strategy was managing corruption. One thing was always fun to meet people in strange countries and learn things, and realize here was a businessman who understood competition and clients and customers as much as anybody else in this room did, but the kind of barriers that he faced to creating lots of bars, employing lots of people, were pretty huge. So it left me with a very strong sense of there's a huge amount of talent in the third world. It faces a number of problems that if they were here would trip people up there. And that gave me a bit of a passion for it, which is why I've gone back to Africa a number of times and done a number of things. Anyway, that's a sort of little story about what gave me a taste for it. So I'll shut up at this point and then come back to answer questions when it's my turn. Thank you.
I'm Brooke Partridge. I am in the Emerging Market Solutions Organization at Hewlett-Packard here in Palo Alto, just down the road. And I prepared a few comments about why a company like HP would be interested in development. We actually partner with a lot of NGOs and with governments around the world to look at and address development issues. And so the question is, why would HP want to do something like that? And the answer is pretty simple. It's shareholder value. It's about creating more shareholder value. And there are many ways in which our contributions and our involvement in development do that for our shareholders. And so I'm going to talk about that a little bit, but I want to step back for just a minute and say that's a pretty provocative statement to say that we're in this development for our own development. That is what makes it sustainable for HP. We have a huge and long history of philanthropy and community contribution in the company. It's part of our culture, and that is something that is probably, I would say, very much apart from the shareholder value topic that I just addressed. So it's not that HP doesn't have that sense of contribution to our communities or as a global citizen, but for HP to make the kinds of investments that we do today in development, there has to be some demonstrable return to the company, or else we can't continue to make those kinds of investments on a long-term basis. And in fact, I would like to see HP grow its investments for global development. And the only way to justify that and validate it for the company is to show that there's a return. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how it is we talk about and look at development within HP in terms of the business value to the company. So there are, as I mentioned, several different dimensions to it. First of all, of the 100 largest economies in the world, 51 of them are corporations. And HP is one of those corporations, which means that HP has a significant amount of influence in the global economy. And we take that seriously in terms of having responsibility, but also that means we have the ability to impact the economy, the global economy, in a positive way, which also then comes back to growing markets for HP. So that's where the loop is in that particular dimension. Secondly, as you look at governments around the world, they are looking increasingly at the triple bottom line, not just evaluating, the market is not only looking at revenues and profit from companies, but also looking at their impact on environment and social issues. So again, coming back to shareholder value for the company, we need to be looking at how we impact the environment. And then finally, the key to corporate growth in the 21st century is in emerging markets. It's in developing economies, and HP has to be looking at that. That's not 20 years from now. It's not even 10 years from now. It's 5 years from now. It's 3 years from now. We need to be looking at how to grow our business in emerging markets. When you look at growth rates in the IT industry today in the developed world, those growth rates are at about 5% and declining a little bit. In the developing world, growth rates are at 12%, and they're scheduled to only accelerate. So that is really where growth is going to be coming for HP. And when you look at companies like HP in terms of size and breadth, forget the industry. When you're that big and you're playing in that many markets, you have to be looking at how you can grow markets and not just gain market share, because the presence and the competition is such that you have to be looking for new ways to create business. So those are the different dimensions. I'll talk for just a minute about how HP is approaching doing business in developing economies. And I'm going to focus on the last point that I mentioned, which is corporate growth. That's really where I focus my time and energies. HP has significant investments in terms of resource and dollars in environmental issues, in philanthropy, as I mentioned, in global citizenship in general. The Emerging Market Solutions team is really about developing solutions that HP commercializes for the benefit of developing economies. And so that's really what I'm going to talk about for a few minutes. It's when large companies like HP look at growth opportunities, there's an interesting balance, because the global footprint, the global presence of HP gives us a capability to address these markets in a very comprehensive and powerful way. And yet we don't want to disturb the mainstay businesses of the company, because HP, for instance, every product line or every business category at HP has to sell millions of units a month just to stay profitable, just to stay where we are. So when you're looking at a business team like I lead in HP, 20 people, volumes that are interesting to us, but not even on the radar screen for the larger business organizations, it's important to understand that they have other areas of focus, they have other incentives. So HP wants to see us get traction and build these markets and address these opportunities of development in other countries, and somehow utilize the footprint or the capabilities that we have on a global scale without distracting our main businesses, our mainstay businesses. So that's some of the balance that we have to go through. So 3 years ago, HP created the Emerging Market Solutions team, which is a protected startup organization looking at emerging markets and trying to understand how to address them. Let me just clarify what we're talking about in terms of emerging markets. Every multinational has operations in most countries of the world. And so when you go to a country like India or China or Brazil or South Africa, you'll find most multinationals there. But they're addressing only sort of the top of the Prahalad economic pyramid, right? They're addressing that small population in those countries. We're looking at how to address the larger population, the masses. And so when you take a pure business approach, the first step is to understand the needs of that population. And the needs of that population revolve around social and economic development. So the key to tapping into those markets today is in creating technology solutions that meet those needs, that accelerate social and economic development. And that's what we're doing. So 3 years ago, that was our charter. And the question was, who's doing it well, what can we learn? And what we found very quickly was there really weren't very many organizations out there doing it at all. So we started from first principles, and we started these programs called the iCommunities. One north of Johannesburg, the other in southern India, in Andhra Pradesh. And these were public-private partnerships done in conjunction with the local government and with the local communities to understand their needs for social and economic development. And we went through a process of engaging with them. I was fortunate enough to be at the kickoff meeting for the South African iCommunity, and we spent 3 days with the local communities and the local governments, and we didn't speak once about technology. We had a very interesting facilitated process of discussing the needs of these communities. And it was only after that time that we talked about how IT could come into play to help with those communities. And through that process, we eventually deployed an IT infrastructure in these communities. You can equate them to about the size of a U.S. county. And we deliver programs to these communities in conjunction with the local government. A very interesting and on the surface philanthropic effort on the part of HP. But the learnings from those engagements fed the team that I lead in Palo Alto, where we actually develop solutions and commercialize them and spread them more broadly across the emerging market world for HP's benefit and also for the benefit of the markets in which these solutions can become available. So the first solution that we commercialized was the 441, which stands for 4 users for 1 PC. We modified a Linux-based HP PC so that 4 users can operate from the computer at the same time. So you've got 4 monitors, 4 keyboards, 4 mice, and you've got 4 people sitting around it, operating independently and simultaneously from 1 PC. If you think about it, the capacity on all our computers is way more than we actually ever use, the processing capability. So we looked at a way to harness that differential between the actual user needs and the capability of the processor to figure out how to spread that across more users. So that was something that we launched in South Africa about a year ago, and we're currently expanding that into other geographies, making it commercially available. Interestingly, we've had a lot of pull from the developed world as well, especially in the education industry, education sector. And we're also rolling the iCommunities into their next phase of existence, where we'll be preserving the programs that are going on there, but then also bringing in governments from other developing countries to come and see what we've done in these programs and help them figure out how to do something similar in their own countries. So it would be revisionist history to say that this was all planned out with a lot of foresight. It was really, we kept our eye on the ultimate goal and took a lot of twists and turns in terms of how we developed the organization and how we pursued all these opportunities. But it's been a very exciting ride, and I've probably gone over my 10 minutes now, so I'll end with that.
That's great. That was actually, the end of that was actually a good segue into what I'd love to hear you talk about next, which is just more specifically, I think it was a great overview of very different experiences in private sector development, but more specifically, some of the projects that your organizations are working on. What are the more interesting things, the more cutting edge things? What are the hot topics in private sector development and what your businesses are doing right now? We want to know sort of what's going on in the space. can you share some of the things that you're working on at a more detailed level, like the 441 example? And Jane, if you want to give a bit more background as well, feel free to
Yeah, I
some
feel
of what you
like
do.
I got the
Please.
first matter disadvantage or whatever it's called. And probably their sensitivity around Bechtel being in the Bay Area, you probably know we're always sensitive. What we say, similar to HP, I mean, when we do development, we do look at profit as well. And it's sort of a difficult role that I'm in because I'm an investor in projects, whereas Bechtel's a contractor. So where do we make our money, right? So that's sort of a hot topic in terms of international development. I don't know if HP runs across it, but I know some of the telecommunications companies do too. They want to build infrastructure. They want to be the telecoms provider, yet they also invest in these projects. So where do they make their money? Do they make their money in their return or from selling equipment? Similar for Bechtel, do we make our money from our investment or from building the power plant? And the answer is both. It's supposed to be a win-win situation. There's a Chinese wall in between. But if you think about it, if a power project, in simple terms, costs $100, I'm an investor, I have partners, and I borrow money. So let's say project financings are usually 30% equity, 70% debt, with a local partner, depending on local government specifications. You can't be, normally it's very difficult to be wholly foreign owned in a country. So let's say I'm 15% owner, or 50% owner with a local partner, 50%, 70% debt. I put $15 into the project, but I make $100 over by being a contractor. So where does it come out? Do we raise the price of 101 and then I put in 15.03? So you see the dilemma there, being a contractor or a vendor in doing infrastructure. So, but it's usually win-win. If the construction price is too high, it's not going to make money because you got to cover your capital costs and your revenues and you still have to pay your operating costs. And a bank will not lend if a project is not profitable. So it usually comes out that the construction price is usually normal, the investment is a good investment. And let's be honest, they're competitors. If we're too high, no one's going to let us be contractors. So that's one of the issues we face. Other things about development, why I sort of didn't get into it, but he told a great story. I like doing development because I liked working with local countries, local governments, local partners, and seeing what was going on. You know, there's always this, the U.S. company goes in, we think we can build everything, we just ignore everything that's going on in the country. You can't do that. We have to see what the local norms are, how we, you know, if we relocate people, we have to give them skill training, build them new houses, etc. And it's always, and it's tough being the foreign investor too, because when you try to buy land, people say, oh, you know, you said you pay me $2,000 when we might have said $100. And we worked with one partner, and it was really interesting. This we could never do as a U.S. company, I don't think, going into Indonesia. But our partner there was a real estate developer, and it wasn't a project I worked on, but they told us the story because we're going to build a pipeline. And said, oh, don't worry about the land. We've got that covered. And we said, no, we have experience buying land. We sign a contract. A year later, they'll say, no, I never signed that contract. They said, we know how to figure that out. What they did is they buy land, and they'd have these landowners sign these contracts. But not only would they sign these contracts, they'd give them the cash. They'd put a pile of cash on the table with the contract and have the guy smiling, and they'd take a Polaroid. And they'd staple it to the contract. And a year later, no one could say, they'd say, is that you? And they'd say, yeah. Then we bought the land, we're the landowners. And that is something, I cannot see Bechtel ever doing that. A local partner could do that, but not us. And I have more stories like that I think are more interesting. But that's sort of the gist. I mean, you have to work with local countries. You have to respect their laws and, you know, just the culture. And that was the interesting part, working in different countries. About licenses, one thing with Bechtel, we practice Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Everything we do is by the book, and we have to pick pretty top-tier partners when we go in and obey all government laws and things like that. I just had to put that in.
Did you want to say anything else about any specific things that Bechtel is working on right now?
Right now, it's still the same thing. We're sort of focusing on power. A lot of civil projects, transportation. We're doing a lot of work in London right now with the underground. And actually, this is what's interesting too, is this public-private partnership. I don't know if you know, a lot of these publicly run infrastructure projects don't make money. For example, rail, I don't know if you know, there's one rail project in the world that makes money, and that's the MTR in Hong Kong. But that only covers the operating costs, not the capital costs. So each time, BART goes up, I don't freak out. I'm like, okay, this goes somewhere. But that's sort of what we're trying to help tackle. Watch, BART goes up tomorrow and I'll freak out. But that's what we're trying to help. Same with power and water. Water is a sticky issue. We tried water. We partnered with, what were they called, a UK firm to develop water projects all over the world. And it was called International Water Holdings. Because we sort of piggyback off of power, where the whole privatization of power came about. But water's sticky. If people don't pay their bills, you can't turn off their water. They'll die. Whereas with power, you can turn it off, they're in the dark, okay, they'll pay their bill the next month. And so that's what we're sort of tackling. There's a lot of things that have been free in the world, and what do you do to convince the public that it's okay to start paying? We looked at water in the Philippines, and you can just go all over the country, and there are just all these leaks in the pipes. And as much as you try to convince the people, look, we're going to fix it, the water's going to be cleaner, and you'll pay a little, not a lot more, we'll charge the corporations more, etc. It's a hard thing to convince people that they have to pay something for that they're not used to. And so we're still tackling that, and that's why you see kind of the highs and lows of privatization, even in the U.S. I mean, the California power crisis, I mean, we try to charge market prices and deregulate, and now we're sort of back where we started, right? So.
Thanks. John, like the PAI again?
Yeah, a lot of the last 2 years I've done work for a family of companies called DAI, which is based in DC, and the DC company is called DAI, but there's one in London called BANIC that I ran for a while, one in South Africa called ECI Africa. And each of these companies does contract work for governments in third world countries on development issues. So the UK, the EU, the US have budgets for aid, most of which goes into quite specific projects. A lot of the work that I was working on was on areas of small and medium-sized enterprise development. So, for example, the British government has a pretty good relationship with the government of Uganda. The government of Uganda says we really want to encourage small business, we want to deregulate the economy, and BANIC has a big team of people working in Uganda on how to do that. Concrete example, after the initial study, there was a presentation to a lot of bureaucrats in Uganda, and they said, we've done some research here and we've discovered that to open a business in Uganda, just to get the permits, it takes 40 hours of sitting in government offices to get the permit to just open a business, right? And everyone just apparently looked blank. They said we have two problems. One is it should take at most half an hour, and the second thing is you don't think that's a problem, right? This is a very serious issue. If you want businesses to succeed, you've got to help. There's a lot of work we did in financial sector deepening. If you go to most small businessmen in poor countries, one of the major problems they face is access to capital. Like, you can't borrow money, even to get inventory. So you end up spending all your time running back and forth, getting a day's worth of inventory to sell it, as opposed to buying a week's worth and therefore spending more time selling it. Now, in reality, people can pay up to 30% interest a month and still make profit on it. So actually getting capital to people makes a huge difference. And there's a whole bunch of work that can really make a big difference there in terms of getting banks to be able to develop the skills to lend to people. I mean, some of it's microfinance and so on and so forth. But net of it is getting all these little rinky-dink projects onto a commercial basis so they can sustain themselves and really bring capital to it. And I guess what I'd say is that one of the key things that I've learned from all this stuff is that you don't have to be that glamorous for all these things to make a huge difference in development. I'll give you two examples from my time in South Africa. One of them is telephone boxes. Now, you're looking kind of blank. What do you mean by telephone box? Well, how many people here have a cell phone? All right. Now, a lot of poor people in South Africa have access to a cell phone. You may say, how do they have access to a cell phone when it's expensive? Well, a whole network now has built up in Johannesburg of people who have a box where they will sell time on their cell phone, a minute ago, right? So you can go there, you can give them a few rand, and you have a minute on the cell phone. Now, the reason it works is because, first of all, there are very few landlines outside the old areas of Johannesburg, because the old government, under apartheid, didn't want to put telephones in areas where white people didn't live in case people fomented insurrection. So now you come to now, when if you're going to start telephones, you might as well go to cell phones. And the way that you distribute the cell phone around many people is to have a little entrepreneur who says, here I go. Now, initially when they started this, everyone thought this was bonkers. It turns out that Vodacom, the biggest cell phone company in South Africa, has more volume coming out of these little entrepreneurs than their entire prepaid business. It's a huge volume for them, right? Now, it seems kind of weird. If you go there, it makes a huge difference. This has been a huge boon for Vodacom, tons and tons of volume, and anybody who's ever used it, it makes a big difference, right? The other one, who were talking about BART, right? I came down from San Francisco today by public transport. Right? Now, it took me an hour and 50 minutes, right, with everything being on time, to get from San Francisco to here, right? That's 35 miles. Right? I guarantee you, it would have taken me less than an hour to get from Johannesburg to Pretoria in South Africa, right? Using the taxi system. Taxis in South Africa is a word for little minibuses that run around. It would have cost me a lot less money and had no government subsidy whatsoever, right? The cow train is mainly paid for by the taxpayer. There's tons of, the whole of South Africa is covered by what are called minibus taxis. It's a very efficient form of public transport. It's completely private enterprise. It's very, very cheap. It's very, very fast. It's very unglamorous. I mean, it doesn't use much HP technology, but it really, really works, right? And so a lot of these folks who create tons of jobs, get people from A to B, don't use any subsidies. So a lot of these little opportunities don't have to be too glamorous, but they can really make a huge difference. And actually focusing on those makes a big difference in development, I believe.
Can I just follow up on that and ask how, as a consulting firm, DAI or Vantage helps to enable these businesses to develop?
Okay, let me give you a couple of concrete examples. One is DAI and Vantage do a lot of work with banks and finance organizations in developing countries on how you lend to small businesses. Right? Now, this may seem obvious, it's not. Because in this country, if you lend to a small business, normally what you do is you try and get a huge amount of data on that person. You go get your social security number, it all cascades out, right? You can't do that in a lot of developing countries because the data's not there. So what you have to do is to develop a method for understanding the business, actually going out there and looking at people, right? It's a set of skills. Moreover, even if you know the person, right, here, if you default on your credit card, someone comes after you, there's a process. A lot of poor countries, you can't do that. All the title laws are messed up. So you have to have some method of understanding how to collect. That's a set of skills. Now, getting it right is possible. There's tons of these lending schemes to small businesses in poor countries that have less than 1% default rate. It is doable. There's just a set of skills that go with that. You have to teach people how to do that. That's sort of one thing. There's another set of programs that the companies have done directly helping small businesses. One of the best of the lot is called TEP. Now, what does that mean? Tourism Enterprise Project. Again, in South Africa, there is a huge program there to get small businesses into tourism. Now, tourism is a fantastic sector for small businesses because what you have is invariably in any country a couple of huge players, which is normally the airline or the airlines, and something like a hotel chain, right? And maybe a brewery, right? And then you have tons of small operators doing tours, minibus operators, park operators, guest houses. And so if you really want to help lots of small businesses prosper, right, that's a great sector. Now, not only does it create lots of jobs, not only does it actually, get people out of poverty, it's actually kind of fun and it's very ambassadorial. I would say anybody here, if you have the chance, one thing you could do for development is go and spend money in poor countries. It's a good thing to do and it's fun as well. And by doing that, you're actually giving somebody a decent job and building a relationship. Who knows where that goes? So that's the kind of stuff we did at DAI and ECI Africa about.
Actually, I'd like to add to what John was just talking about. We've also been looking at the microfinance industry in general. There is more microfinance funding out in the developing world than ever reaches qualified recipients because it's so manual. And one of the reasons it's so manual is because they do have a system that allows the lenders to qualify people through their personal interactions, and part of the repayment rates, why they're so high, is because there's a sense of personal interaction with the collector who comes into town, etc. So we've been looking for ways to allow IT to benefit the microfinance industry so that more people can receive the benefits of microfinance without changing the qualities of the system today that make it so successful, like this interpersonal connection. So rather than creating more centralized banks or ATMs or things that would depersonalize the system, we recently implemented a pilot in Uganda in conjunction with USAID to actually, I bet, how many of you have worked on this project? So I know we have some people from Stanford working on this. So we've got a few here. Okay, great. So the pilot in Uganda is really about how to create mobile technology that accompanies the individual, the representative, and at the same time allows for that continued personal interaction. And as we have looked at this application for mobile technology, this remote transaction system, we've also discovered other commercial verticals where this would have great application in developing countries, from supply chain to healthcare delivery, and even SMBs, small medium businesses who do a lot of transactions out in the field. So it's a great innovation in a particular vertical that we've gone very deep in, that HP is really invested in, that will hopefully benefit the microfinance industry more broadly than even HP will be involved. But also it helped us discover some other verticals where we might apply that same technology.
I'm going to follow up on that as well, because I'm really curious as to what I heard you say about HP and what I heard a little before when you did a project with them was that part of HP's modus operandi for doing this is that they wanted to learn more about these developing markets. So they thought there was business opportunity, they thought they wanted to have social impact, but this was also a way that all these, as you said in your opening, all these markets are opening up. They're going to be the future of growth for most multinational corporations in the next, you said, in the 21st century, but even sooner. So how much of this is learning for you in some of the projects that you do, and how important is that?
It's 110% learning. It's all learning. I mean, we've brought together a lot of very entrepreneurial people with a lot of international experience and great connections in developing countries, and we still knew nothing when we started. It's just a whole new field. And we've created and fostered a learning environment within the Emerging Market Solutions team, because we have to be willing to skin our knees and make mistakes. When we first came to market with the 441, we knew there'd be a lot of mistakes to make in terms of refining the business model. And so we specifically chose South Africa, which for HP is sort of an off-Broadway market, so that we could skin our knees, rather than going to India or China or Brazil, where it would be a much more public sort of activity.
That's great. I'll ask one or two more questions and I'll open it up. I guess maybe broadening that question a little bit, I think all business in the developing world has a mix of business impact that you're trying to have and that you need to have if you're going to do it. That's that you have to make money at the end of the day, but you're also trying to create a social impact. So how much do you, at each of your firms, think about those two things together? Is it really all business? Do you think with the CSR something that comes up? And how is that portrayed? How do these two aspects, business impact and social impact, mix together for you in the work that you do?
It's every project we look at sustainable development and also just the community we're affecting. We have a PR group that goes on location for every project. We think about everything before we even develop it. It comes down even to, there's one project in the UK, a power project, and during the kind of due diligence phase, SUVs would go out to the site, and the SUV would make tracks, and then after a few days it would rain, and they noticed all these geckos would be caught in the tracks, and they go, oh no, we have a problem here. They kind of halted everything, and they had to redesign things, and what they did is they built a fence around the power project, and they put little buckets to catch these geckos, because they knew that these geckos would end up in the power project and die. And so every week someone has to go out and empty the geckos. I mean, so they think about sustainable development. No one knew except the SUV that kept going every week, and they're like, what's going on? And also just livelihood too. When we have to relocate communities, it sounds horrible, but we do the best for the community. We relocate them, we build them new houses, we give them livelihood training if it's depending on the laws of the country. A power project we built in the Philippines called the Quezon Power Project. We relocated, I think, 100 or so families. I didn't work on it, so I don't know how many. But they built them each a new home. They were living in shanties. So we built them a concrete home, built furniture inside, a community center with basketball courts, swings, everything. And we gave everyone livelihood training. And we thought we really helped the community. We were bringing power. We gave them new homes, and it's so funny. When you give people something, they want more. the developer on it said, you know, these people were living in shanties. We gave them this great home, and then they came and knocked on our door and said, you know, can we have driveways? And the guy's like, but you don't have a car. He's like, well, I mean, now we're like rich, so maybe we will have cars one day. So we were giving hope to this community. It's great when we do that. So.
I mean, I'm very of mixed mind about corporate social responsibility. I think at one level it's a very good thing to be aware of your impact on the community. And I really think as a business, as business people, the best thing we can do is create lots of sustainable jobs. I think if you go work in a poor country and open an operation that gives 1,000 people a decent living they wouldn't otherwise have had, I think you should go to bed at night feeling pretty good about that. Right? And that in my mind is corporate social responsibility. You shouldn't do it in a way that's inconsiderate. I mean, if in doing it, for example, you can create a decent healthcare facility with your 1,000-person factory, then that's super, because the chances are people weren't going to get access to decent healthcare anyway, and now it's cheaper for you to do it than buying individually. That said, I would be aware of corporate social responsibility that really is PR in rich countries, which often I think as absolutely counterproductive to what helps people in poor countries. It very much stops companies investing there, and I think a lot of this stuff is window dressing that I would very much warn against. I think judge firms of what they really do on the ground in poor countries, and if you're really getting a lot of poor people out of poverty into a decent living, that actually has to be respected, I think. Well, that's one of you.
Well, with that said, I mean, when we invest in these countries, I mean, you do have local laws and how many people you employ locally too. I mean, we usually go in, and Bechtel is usually maybe the project manager, but everyone we employ is usually local as well. I mean, I sort of forget that because we do that, so it's just the norm.
So I think I addressed this in my opening remarks, but we identify the opportunity to address the needs of social and economic development in these countries as in a way that can be sustainable for HP as well. So I don't separate the social value from the business value for HP. We're addressing those needs in a way that's sustainable.